Okay, welcome back to another epic conversation on caste Chronicles, decoding discrimination with Professor Sumeet Mhaskar. I think I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yeah,
Mhaskar,
it's
it is.
fine. Sumit Mhaskar. Yeah.
Okay. This is another rewriting episode brought to you by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. It is the go-to space for thought-provoking conversation. Make sure you are tuned into this podcast series by SARIM with Senior Research Associate Heman. Today, we have the privilege of chatting with a distinguished guest whose research navigates the intricate intersection of caste, religion, and tapestry of Indian society. He is not just a researcher, he is a storyteller, weaving narratives that echo the struggles, trumps, and the untold story of marginalized community. You might know him from the episodes like exploring Ambedkar's unexpected role as a labor leader, discussing the ongoing fight for Dalit rights, or even uncovering the complex politics within the Indian universities. But today we are peeling back the layers even further with a brilliant mind, none other than Professor Dr. Samit Mashkar. We will dwell into the nitty-gritty of caste discrimination, this historical echoes shaping our present and the challenges that persist in our society towards an equitable society. In this episode, we will be unraveling the labor movement led by iconic B.R. Ambedkar, exploring the fight for Dalit rights and navigating the complex landscape of university politics, all with a seasoned sociologist. In this episode, in your episode, Ambedkar labor leader, Dalit rights matter, and the university politics in India, Professor Maskar dwells into the heart of these societal issues, uncovering tales of resilience, struggle, and trumps. So whether you are a seasoned scholar, a curious mind, or just someone looking for a fascinating journey through Indians' socio-culture landscape, you are in a treat. Join us as we unveil the mysteries of caste and religion with the Professor Sumit Mashkar. It's time to tune in, turn up, and let's the conversation get started. Mr. Mashkar, as your research explores around urban spaces that undergo restructuring, how does caste discrimination manifest itself in these environments, particularly in terms of access to employment, housing, and other essential services?
Yeah. Thank you, Heman, for having me on your podcast studio. It's a very interesting series. I have myself followed some of the episodes. As for your question is concerned, first we have to understand that what do we mean by urban and its relation to caste. So, historically speaking, scholars have argued that as we move towards urbanization and industrialization, all these identities, ascribed identities such as caste, gender, religion, or region, ethnicity, will become irrelevant. That is, they will play no role in individuals' economic life, their housing, or in any way, it will not be very relevant. Now, this is from early 20th century we are talking about. Interestingly, we don't have many studies in the Indian context for sure that actually went into investigating how actually caste, just to focus on one identity, actually operates in the urban context where it is supposed to be irrelevant. However, if we look at several studies, there is constant reference to caste. There is reference to caste having being a barrier, particularly for those in the lower order of the caste hierarchy, particularly the Dalits, the untouchables, and of course those who are at the superior position in the caste hierarchy. They have better options in the labor market. So that has been the case historically, and that continues to be the case. Now, obviously, the current transformation that we are looking at, the urban transformation for the last 20 years, is also taking place in the context when India is a democratic society. And also at the local level, you have different kinds of power negotiations that people have to do. So, in that sense, What we had the situation 100 years ago is not necessarily the same. And caste obviously has adapted itself by and large to the extent that those who are at the superior position continue to have better opportunities, and those who are at the bottom level in terms of caste hierarchy seems to have limited opportunities, or they experience discrimination in the labor market. However, this is not to say that people have not entered the labor market where there is discrimination happening. Some changes are taking place, but by and large, the structures that discriminate individuals on the basis of caste are still very important.
Your research also explores the vulnerabilities of workers. How does caste contribute to the challenges faced by those individuals at the lower end of Indian's economy? Or there any specific instances or patterns do you have identified in your research?
As I said, structures like caste are very important, and they operate even today, not just in occupations like individual jobs, but also the kind of what is called as self-employed occupations, their own account workers. Like you have street side some stalls where you sell fast foods or you sell some small kind of items. So all of these places also have big challenges. Overall, I think the overall South Asian context, I would say, but specifically for India, overwhelming majority of the workers have been part of what is known as the informal sector. That is the same sector where you have low wages, higher working hours, absolute absence of social security provisions, no scope for unionizations, pretty much, and it is working since 1950, and that number has now gone to 94-95%, which essentially means that there has been decrease in the formal sector, and particularly those jobs which provide formal conditions of employment, where you have stipulated wages, you have working hours, you have clear-cut working conditions, you get health benefits, you get other kinds of social security benefits, and you cannot be kicked out of jobs just because the employers feel like. So, in that sense, that story has always been a very small story in terms of very few people. So, out of 100, only 8 people maximum had benefits of such jobs. And that number has now come down to out of 100, maybe 3 or 4 or maximum 5 jobs. So, overall, this is the situation as far as workers at the lower end of the economy are.
Uh, uh, you know, uh, there are the particular kind of occupation. The lists do not have the any particular kind of, have the not the designated occupation. For that, how do you observe caste influencing the type of jobs individual taking up, especially in lower strata of the Indian's economy?
See, as far as caste structure is concerned, the more you are towards the upper end of the caste structure, you have more flexibility, you have more choices choose from. The more you go at the lower end of the caste structure, your choices are extremely limited. Now, what we see as far as those at the bottom end of the economy are concerned, and also at the caste structure, that Dalits particularly end up being, or rather, they are compelled to work in what I call occupations as far as Dalits are compelled to work. Because if they try to enter other occupations, they face discrimination and therefore they are kicked out from those. Like a overwhelming majority of that section is pushed into what is the stigmatized occupations. And these are the occupations which any society will require somebody to do for any system to function. Now, at the same time, you have a certain kind of mobility within the Dalits. Part of this is due to the affirmative action policies, the reservation policies in India, whereby you have several generations of Dalits entering into white collar occupations, or they have entered into the non stigmatized occupations. And that number, although is in terms of proportion is small, in terms of absolute number, it is very significant. People are also going abroad. So you have these two variation within Dalits. So one section of Dalits are still more or less stuck in the kind of occupations. Um, of course, this is not to say that they are not resisting those occupations. In many cases, they are resisting the occupations. Politically, these are the most aware groups. It's just the nature of the economy that it is controlled by particular castes and communities. In the case of India, these are predominantly the upper caste communities and also the trading Banya, Jain, and Marwadi communities. It is because of the control of capital that Dalits' occupational choices are limited in that sense.
Okay, as you said that the Dalits' occupational choices are very limited. With your observation, do you find any correlation between caste dynamic and participation in labor or social movement? How does caste influence a collective response to the challenges such as job loss or economic shift?
So the way it works in the labor scenario with respect to their participation in the social movement, particularly the labor movement itself. So we have a very interesting story where the employer and the employee belong to the same caste. The chances of having a protest are very limited. And the classic case that we know of is the diamond cutting industry in Gujarat, where the employer as well as the employees belong to the same caste. So this is one example. But as far as the industries where you have mixed population of all various castes, there are always tensions in terms of the participation, and historically speaking, that has been the case. But in the organized spaces, let's say for the municipal corporation, which was under the government for a very long time, and that is still the case, but now there is a move towards contractualization. So there, obviously, you have mostly Dalits working in the municipal, the sanitation work particularly. So there you find less conflict along caste lines. So if you want to study caste conflict, you will have to pick up a sector where you have mixed of population. Where there is far more homogeneity, there you won't find much. And when there is far more heterogeneity, this is where, historically speaking, you always had these conflicts between Dalits and other castes, but also the Muslim minority or the other regional minority groups, depending on which city they are working.
Okay, talking about the iconic Ambedkar role as a leader, did you come across any instances where caste and religion played a significant role in shaping labor dynamic? And how did Ambedkar address these challenges back then?
So Dr. Ambedkar's work is obviously ignored so far by the academic scholarships and also by the trade unionists in many ways. And that is a bigger problem right now because of this neglect, both by the trade unionists, particularly the mainstream left trade unionists. That aspect is less studied right now. So there are very few people, myself included, who actually seriously take up this question of Ambedkar's intervention into the labor questions, into the labor movement. Now, as far as Dr. Ambedkar's intervention is concerned, there are several moments where he participated in the labor movement, where he made common cause with the other trade unions. And the classic example is that of the 1928 Bombay textile strike, where he decided to participate in the strike, but on the condition that the discrimination faced by Dalits should be one of the important points of agenda that the unions must take. Because in the highest paid weaving department in the cotton textile mills of Bombay, Dalits, particularly the Mahar caste, they were prohibited from working in that department on the excuse of untouchability. Now, Ambedkar made a common cause with other unions as long as they take this issue seriously. They also said yes, they will take it, but eventually that did not really work in practicalities. So these kind of tensions remained, but Ambedkar continued to make alliances with them when there was necessity in terms of strikes in the 1938 famous strike. And then, but he was very clear on one thing, that the question of caste and untouchability was extremely central within the labor movement for him. And as long as that was not addressed, he was not ready to make any kind of adjustments. And that is the role that needs to be really examined further, I personally think. But also his role in the rural labor is still largely understudied. Of course, there are people who have written in Economic and Political Weekly and some other places. So he has played an extremely important role in through his newspaper, the New Weekly Janta, through his intervention as the Legislative Council member, through his position as a barrister, whereby he fought cases, and through different kinds of leading different kinds of movements. So his role has been absolutely wide ranging when it comes to the labor question. And there have been moments where he, as I said, has raised these questions of untouchability, particularly, and how this is actually restricting the choices of occupation.
So, caste and religion do not go hand in hand. While you examined the Ambedkar role in labor movement, how did you uncover the instances where the interplay of caste and religion had a notable impact on the direction and outcome of these movements?
See, caste and religion is they definitely go hand in some way. So we need to correct that particular view, because caste is part of the Hindu religious system. So the legitimacy that certain caste will have certain kind of rights come from the Hindu religious scriptures, and therefore caste and religion very well go hand in hand. Now, if we want to talk about caste vis-a-vis other religions such as the Muslim minority in Bombay city or other kind of religions, so the regional variations will apply. But so within Muslims also there are different castes. So, for example, during the 1928 strike that I mentioned, Dalits were not allowed to work in the weaving section because of the the pollution kind of because their presence is polluting in the weaving process. That's what the upper caste, particularly the Maratha caste workers, argue. And therefore, what we see is that during one of the meetings that Ambedkar was addressing, there were also members of the Julaha community, the weaver Muslim caste, whereby they promised that they will ensure that they will train the Dalit workers in the weaving department, so that if the upper caste workers such as the Marathas are not helping them or making it difficult for them to work in the department, they will work together with the Dalits in terms of training. So that kind of relations have been there. As I said, this is an aspect that needs to be explored really further. So there is far more potential in this research, and I hope that I will be able to write some of it, but also hope that other scholars will also intervene in this issue.
So, as you have a major, contribution on the politics in school politics, I have gone through your conversation on the caste dismissed Dalit schooling in colonial India.
Hmm.
How does the historical narrative highlight the instances of caste discrimination in colonial education system?
Yeah, so for from that recording, I'll just take a leaf and say that it's a very systemic kind of discrimination. So that is the first time when the Britishers opened the schools, um, everybody wanted to avail those particular kind of facilities. But the upper caste resisted the entry of Dalits and what we consider today the other backward classes, or the other backward castes in India. These are predominantly the Shudra Jatis. And so this was a very strong opposition. And it was not just a very gentle opposition that they wanted to say. There was absolute militancy There was physical violence against Dalits, and their jobs were threatened if they sent their children to the schools. So there were various kinds of pressures that were put on Dalits so that their children don't go to the schools, and same also with the Shudra communities. So it was a very systematic kind of attempt to exclude the Dalits and the Shudras from the educational system. But with the arrival of the colonial rule, of course, it was not possible to strictly, follow that particular kind of rule. Nonetheless, there were some doors that were opened up for Dalits as well as the Shudras to take education. But at the same time, the upper caste did manage to retain their control over education. And that is the reason we continue to see what we understand as historical advantage. That is, the upper caste today are in a position of historical advantage that their previous generations not only went to the schools but to the universities and higher education, and their children continue to also benefit from that historical advantage. At the same time, Dalits or even the Shudra Jatis face what we call as the historical disadvantage. That is, you were excluded from the schools and only some managed to. And therefore, there is a historical disadvantage for the entire community. And as a country, only in the 21st century, now that we see a big bunch of, army of educated people among the Dalits or even the Shudra Jatis. But this change already began taking place in mid 19th century. 1850s is the time when the democratization of education began in the schools, and slowly but surely, post-independence era also opened up bigger opportunities. But nonetheless, we still need more efforts to make the education democratic to the Dalits, to the other backward castes, and to all the other kind of religious minority groups, as well as the urban poor and the rural poor.
So I will go back to my last question, that how do the insight from caste dismissed contribute to our understanding of modern education system and any persisting caste-based challenges in contemporary education sectors?
I think, to continue from my previous response, which is to do with historical advantage and disadvantage. Now, the more advantage you have also adapted to the newer systems and the changes that are taking place. So, if your parents and grandparents were university educated people, you also had the advantage of getting into better paid jobs. And now what is happening is the privatization of higher education, where you have more private educational institutions, where you obviously don't have the discrimination the way I talked about upper caste parents opposing the government, the colonial government, to stop Dalits from entering the school. So you don't have that kind of opposition anymore. But what you have is a financial kind of obstacle. And because you have a large majority of Dalits who are historically disadvantaged, and therefore this disadvantage also means that not many people are in the bracket of their financial earnings who will afford these kind of educations. And this is the newer way in which, by and large, Dalits and other vulnerable groups will be excluded from the higher educational systems.
In your another episode on Dalit Rights Matter, the fight for equality and a long road ahead, you discussed about the ongoing struggle of Dalit rights. What are the major challenges faced by Dalit community today in India or in a broader way in South Asia? And how do you see the path forward in the fight for equality?
So there are several challenges right now. But also we have to understand that overall the community as a Dalit community has also come to at a very different juncture right now. So we can't focus exclusively on one aspect of Dalit community and say that that is the entire. As far as Dalit are concerned, you have the Neo Buddhist Dalits in Maharashtra who have made a significant transformation in their own lives in terms of obtaining higher education, and they have really put education at the top priority. And that changes we can see in terms of the national statistics that are available before us. It also has the highest proportion of educated people. Also, in all other respects, they are way ahead. So, therefore, what we need to see is that newer kind of challenges are emerging. So, you have there on one hand that kind of group, but also you have people who are still stuck in the kind of stigmatized occupations where you also have very low earnings. So that is one economic aspect, one is educational aspect. But on the second front, you also have a massive level of politicization among the Dalits, particularly the Ambedkarite Dalits. And these are the Dalits who are extremely vocal about the injustices, particularly meted out due to the caste based practices. They are refusing caste based occupation in the villages. And because of this, they also have to face lots of discrimination. They have to face boycotts for sometimes weeks. They are also demanding due wages or proper wages. So you have different kinds of challenges that are emerging also because Dalits are asserting their rights in the democratic arena, but also in everyday social and economic life. So in some sense, the atrocities also have to be understood against, I mean, some atrocities, not all the atrocities. In some atrocities against Dalit, particularly the physical or the verbal atrocities, because atrocity has a wider definition. It only does not refer to violence. That we must also make clear here. And therefore, Dalits atrocities are also somehow has to be seen in terms of the assertion that they make in the rural and urban settings, which obviously is not appreciated by the upper caste groups. However, upper caste and sometimes you also have the dominant other backward caste groups. They are also in confrontation with the Dalits. So you have wide-ranging kind of challenges, but also newer kind of voices are also coming. So while there is a promise that there is some change that has happened, you also need to take into account that a long road is ahead before Dalits in terms of various kind of issues that needs to be addressed, whether it is in terms of their occupational choices or whether now that the public sector has gone down, should private sector actually take up the role of having reservations there? In terms of education, there are, of course, increasing privatization of higher education. So, what kind of strategies the Dalit movement needs to make in terms of making sure that they avail those facilities? Political reservation is still there very much, but how to effectively use that political reservation so that the benefit reaches the people? And culturally speaking, I think with absolutely less resources, Dalits have managed to mark a very important space in the cultural arena, and I think that needs to be appreciated as well. So I think there is a mixed kind of patterns that have emerged, and the mixed kind of pattern also means that there are mixed kind of strategies that needs to be developed to address different kinds of questions.
Yeah, coming back to the caste discrimination, will you please describe the concisely that from Maratha caste mobilization and discuss the role of caste in demands for affirmative actions or reservation in employment in higher education in 21st century in Maharashtra?
No, no, no. I think Marathas don't face caste discrimination. That needs to be made first clear. Marathas are the dominant caste in terms of numbers. They are very dominant. Also, they have managed to obtain a socially superior position. And I would like to underline this thing again that they have managed to obtain a socially superior position. So historically, they may have been part of the Shudra order, but through the political and economic transformation of the 20th century, they have managed to obtain a socially superior position. Now, the problem is, and which is what I have already discussed at length in some other work, is that the shrinking of well paid jobs for people with less or no education. That has to be first understood. As I said, out of the 100 jobs in 1950, not more than 8 jobs were well paid jobs in terms of the various facilities that are attached to a job. Now that proportion has come down to 3 or 4. And most importantly, all the manufacturing, big manufacturing textile mills, all kind of different huge factories that paid very good salaries plus the benefits, they have completely vanished. There is absolute disappearance of those kind of jobs. And it is in these jobs you had the dominance of the dominant caste such as the Marathas or the upper caste, the Brahmins or the Rajput. Depending on the region, you have these castes who have occupied historically the larger share of those jobs. Now the problem is by the end of 20th century, all these factories have vanished, which also means there is a total disappearance of well-paid jobs for people with less education or people who have vernacular Marathi or Hindi education. And now, therefore, their children who otherwise had access to well-paid jobs historically, the father would send their children to the better paid jobs. So that cycle has stopped now. And because that cycle has stopped, the dominant caste, the upper caste, now are in facing a crisis. And because these are dominant caste, I have framed their problem as the crisis of dominance. That they are facing a crisis of dominance because you can't be just superior in terms of your social status and not have access to economic resources. And in that sense, now you have a big problem that the Maratha community is facing, that they do not have those economic opportunities. And therefore, the demand for reservation, because they feel that reservation will give access to the government jobs, and therefore the problem will be resolved. In my view, which I have already stated, is that of course the proportion of government job is also very tiny. And therefore, this is not going to solve the problem. And we will have a newer kind of challenges. And we are yet to see what kind of challenges that will be thrown. As of now, we have an agitation going on in Maharashtra, whereby they are demanding reservation. But as per the constitutional norms of as to who reservation should be given, they do not necessarily qualify. So then what exactly is the road ahead is for the political class to decide. And therefore, we have to wait and see how it unfolds. But by and large, this is a longer crisis. And it is not going to be resolved because the government has decided almost 25 years ago to go for economic liberalization. We have absolutely no public sector manufacturing jobs. Even the current government jobs in class 3 and 4 are contractualized. And therefore, we have a massive problem in terms of public employment, which will give better salaries and better facilities. And in this context, this crisis is going to stay for a long time.
Talking about your research, you have one extensive on the claiming backwardness, exploring the Maratha caste question in 21st century Maharashtra. What motivated you to dwell into this specific aspect of caste dynamics? In your research, how do you observe the dynamics of Maratha caste in contemporary Maharashtra? What are the key challenges and questions that promoted this research?
So my original research, which I still work on, has been about the textile mill workers of Mumbai. And what I was interested, and I still am interested, is to look at the responses to joblessness. That is, you have these large scale textile mills in Bombay, and when they closed down, nearly 1 lakh workers lost the jobs. So, my interest was to look at their responses. First, in terms of their responses, in terms of finding a new job, and whether they face any discrimination or any challenges based on caste, gender, and religion, number one. The second part was a section, a tiny section, but the respectable number went back to villages. How do they actually cope up with this sudden shift? I mean, historically they have retired in the village, but this was a major shift. And the third is the political mobilization for the housing question. and to ask for better rehabilitation packages from the government. Now, while doing this field work, particularly in the rural Maharashtra, I came across this mobilization already in 2008 and 9. And I realized that this is something that is linked to the transformations of the urban political economy. Of course, Bombay being the major employer, it became very obvious for me that there is a strong connection between the demand for Maratha reservations and the transformation of political economy in the urban settings. And that's how I followed that particular thread. So my work is still largely focused on the textile mill workers of Mumbai, but because I also spent a substantial amount in the rural settings, in the western Maharashtra, the Konkan region, and also a big chunk of my informants were Marathas. So while conducting a large-scale survey of 1,037 workers, plus I conducted more than 80 in-depth interviews, and then there were scores of casual conversation and discussion that I did in Mumbai and in the rural parts of Maharashtra. So that made me realize that, of course, my own story of Mumbai mill workers, I'm currently working on as a book manuscript. But at the same time, I realized that this Maratha question is also important, and very few people are looking at the link between the rural and the urban. Everybody that I have written about the Maratha reservation have primarily focused only on the rural parts. And my contention was that that is not going to provide any answers that why they suddenly mobilized. And therefore, I decided to spend some time on thinking about the Maratha reservation, and from which two journal articles have been published, and more is in the pipeline to explore the various other aspects of the Maratha community in general, and particularly linking with the reservation.
Lastly, having gone through your various interviews and podcast episodes, how do you find and ensure that the discussion on caste and religion uh, reach the diverse audience, including those outside the academic circles?
I think what you are doing and the different podcasts that I have been invited to are the mediums through which our rigorous research reaches the wider audience. Because at the end of the day, what we write in terms of our research papers and books, academic books particularly, cater to a very small amount of academic community across the world. But it is only through the newspapers, it is through the social media, but also the podcast or the video recordings through various news channels. It is through these mediums that we reach wider audience. I try as much as possible to spend time with people who are preparing podcasts like you or other forums so that actually you reach a wider audience and bring your research, sometimes very sophisticated research, to a lay audience who have nothing to do with social science particularly, but nonetheless are interested in society, politics, and economy. And I think it's a very important medium that we have now acquired, particularly the podcast, where people are spending time on listening to these. And I believe that this is one of the ways in which we can reach wider audience.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that the this is the only the way we can reach the larger and wider audience. With that, thank you very much for taking your special valuable time out for this special podcast at SARIM. And thank you very much for joining us. I hope it was as insightful for you as for me and for SARIM's audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Heman. I think this is a very good opportunity for me to also explain so many other things. And I also wish you all the best with your future podcasting.
Thank you. I look forward having such discussions in future.